There are, in a priest's life, there are two groups that you never want to preach to. One are brother priests, because they're merciless. And the second is to lawyers who know something about words and the English language and logic, and this can be a problem. The gospel we have is a little bit anomalous. It's not the Jesus that we normally hear from. So it's important really to kind of unpack this, and in order to do that, we have to go back to what hearers of the time when Jesus gave this parable, what would they think? Because we come at it, whatever gospel we pick up, even the Old Testament, we come at it with our 21st century, or for some of us, 20th century ideas, and we begin to try to make things fit. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't, and it doesn't in this case. Jesus concocts this parable. It's not a recitation of a historic event. He's just spinning a yarn, and he kind of goes, consider this. So this guy gives money to the slaves and expects them to do something with it. And that's really the first roadblock with our 21st century mentality. Unfortunately, we have to talk a little bit about something that God allows to exist in his world called agency law. I don't know why, but he does. In our world, if somebody asks you to do something and you say yes, you're kind of bound. Sometimes it's reduced to contract. But from the minute you say yes or sign the contract, you're the agent for that individual. That is not the case in Jesus' day. You only became an agent when you began to use what you were given for the purpose for which it was given. And the other piece about it is when you were given money, as this gospel says, you had to double it. And that was the task. Now, anything you made over and above that, that was your cut. But you had to double it. And the other thing that sometimes throws folks with this gospel is we talk about talents, and that's led to some, I'm certain, wonderful sermons about don't hide your talent and this, that, and the other thing, but unfortunately it has nothing to do with the gospel, because talent was the name of the coin. Like we'd say a quarter or $50 or whatever. So let's put it all together. This guy, who's kind of insufferable, hands 5 talents to one slave. Now, if the people that are hearing Jesus say this, you could probably kind of see them in your mind's eye kind of shaking their head like, oh, no problem. You can double that, not a problem. 2, well, it's a little tricky, but he might be able to make something out of the deal. 1, that's impossible. This guy is nailed. So the first question we have to ask is, why would the master do that? This guy is set up for failure from the beginning. And how did he determine who gets what? Was it just here, 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 or was it you get 5, you get... We don't know. Jesus didn't make that part of the story. We're left to kind of think about that. And so, true to form, they come back and, here, master, I've made 5 extra talents for you. He's not telling the master what he made on the side, but he doubled it. He did what he was supposed to do. 2, here is 4. He's probably not as happy as the guy with 5, but that's okay. And then the guy with 1 comes up. I know you're a hard guy. You're just not somebody I want to do business with, but there was no way I was going to win. So I took the talent and I buried it. That way nobody could steal it from me. or I wouldn't feel hard-pressed to put food on the table for my family and spend it. Because the other piece of this is, if you didn't double the money, you had to make it up out of your own pocket. So this guy isn't going to win, and he's going to have to come up with another coin out of his own pocket. And clearly, as he was a slave, he's not living in the Hamptons, New York. So what do you got? You got a setup. So here's your coin back. Perfectly legal. He did it absolutely correct. He never became an agent because he never attempted to use the money for the purpose for which it was given. And that's not the way this ogre sees it. And then he's punished for it. Throw him out. You knew I was tough to deal with. You're throwing this back in my face. Get him out of here. This is a parable that is set by Jesus to kind of explain to us that we have a choice to make. Because if you want to play by the rules of the game, that's what could happen to you. If you want to play by the legal rules of what any society you live in at whatever time, sometimes it'll work for you, sometimes it'll work against you. And if that's all you've got, then where's your hope? You know, I hope the judge will see it, whatever. But Jesus isn't worried about a court of law. He's worried about the kingdom of heaven. And he's trying to teach us how to live and how to live with one another and how to spread this gospel that can sometimes be tricky, but in other times are very straightforward. So what do we take away from this? Those of you who are in the legal profession, whether lawyers, judges, social workers, police, sheriffs, whatever. And even beyond that, most of us working in the real world and seeing people day to day, we know that it's tough out there. We know that there are some people that get 5 talents, either through birth, through inheritance, hitting it big at the casino, good hard work. Then there are those that get 2, a little lower down the scale, a little harder to make ends meet. And there are a lot of those that get 1. The question is, where does that 1 come from? Is that birth? Color of the skin? Where you were born? Where you grew up? And I think if you did the math, you'd find that there were a heck of a lot fewer people with 5 than there are with 1. And what are we supposed to do about that? Because Jesus doesn't tell us in this gospel, he tells it in the rest of his story. We come here to celebrate in part Thomas More, who rose to a very high position in the court of King Henry, who was not always a very solicitous person to work with, and he quite literally lost his head over it. He was pretty much running the country, and the next minute, he's not, because of a fickle king with the power to do that. Yes, he's a saint, not because he was martyred for that. He's a saint because of the way he lived. That he knew Henry, he knew how Henry was running the country. He knew how kings in England had always run the country. Yet he chose to be part of the inner circle, probably in the hope of maybe sometime I can move the dial. I would assume that whatever line of work you're in, whatever you do in the world. There are probably times when you wonder whether it's worth it, whether the deck really is stacked, or whether the problems are just so insurmountable that I just can't. And probably you leave home at the end of the office hours and you kind of go and you go, what am I doing? I'm burning out. But you get up the next day and do it anyway. We work in the tribunal and we hear some horrific stories. And there are sometimes they're tough to leave in the office when you go home. Luckily, I live alone, so I don't torture people with stories, but I mean, that's kind of the way it goes. But what are we as Christians? What is Jesus calling us to in this? The way I put it together in my head is somebody has to give voice to the voiceless. Somebody has to pick up after someone else. Someone has to dust people off and send them back into the ring. And why would you do that? If you're pinning your hopes on any legal system, you are going to be disappointed. Whether it's the most honest and best put together legal system in the world, it will make mistakes. What's God's law? Love God and love neighbor. How hard is that? There was a document in the Second Vatican Council that received very little attention at the time, called the Document on Religious Liberty. It was a very highly contested document at the time. It went through more rewrites than any of the other things that Vatican II produced, because it was difficult for the Council Fathers to kind of get their head around what the person who sponsored the document, Father John Courtney Murray, a Jesuit, an American, wanted the church to take a stand on liberty. Why? If I were to say to you, just out of the clear blue sky, domination where possible, toleration where necessary, what group would you think I was talking about? Well, that was the avowed position of the Roman Catholic Church until the beginning of the end of the 1800s and into the middle of the 1900s. We thought for a long time that building up the kingdom of God was like make an actual kingdom, not build up the kingdom of God in people's hearts, in people's heads. That's different. And it's now back in vogue because, we've seen in our own country the past few years that things can be a little dicey. But what does Paul say? Have no anxiety. It's the way things are. You make things better by making yourself better and making your neighbor better. That's how we build a world. One quote from Thomas More you don't hear too often, and I'll end with that. Thomas wrote, "You must not abandon ship in a storm because you cannot control the winds. What you cannot turn to good, you must at least make as little bad as you can."